Community Development Corporation, American, for 40 years and other behavioral problems. And I spent 40 years litigating those issues. So this has always been a priority for me. I've also been involved in the biggest community development corporation in America, which is called Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration. I was on the board for 35 years. That was a model for how do you bring capital, how do you bring equity into Black communities and actually stimulate commerce, which is,
So one of the things I got to give some context, and we're just trying to give like a little bit of a detailed history with RFK. So I'm highlighting certain things in this conversation. But one of the things that I do like is RFK Jr. will go any and everywhere to have a conversation, and noticing how comfortable people are having conversations with various groups. To me, that says a lot about how comfortable you are, and your comfortability is probably an indicator, in my opinion, of being okay, or the type of history that you've had. Like, what do I mean by that? RFK is clearly, when he speaks on certain things, I think he's very comfortable speaking on those because he knows that he has a history of doing these things rather than just throwing something out there that he's not as comfortable with. This is his history. This is who he is. And I think he's very okay with that. And in this interview, Jason Lee actually calls out the fact that he didn't come in asking for, hey, we can only talk about this topic, only talking about that topic. It's just, let's have a conversation.
I'd say the 2 or 3 biggest problems today for Black Americans. So I have very, very strong support within the Black community. And because of this, my history and my legacy. And so I go on every Black podcast that I can. I want to talk to this community. I want to try to figure out how to solve problems. And that's what I'm going to do with my presidency.
Yeah, I was telling you right before we started that I decided to run for Stockton City Council in the District 6, where it's predominantly people of color, where housing put there, no environmental protections, lots of asthma, lots of issues, no economic investment back into the community. To hear you say it, and hopefully people watching that are probably having this self-realization that they live in a community that look like mine, that are having these similar issues, that it's a part of what I've called strategic oppression. Would you agree?
Yeah, you know what's interesting?
So throughout this conversation, you're going to hear Jason Lee talk a little bit about strategic oppression. And he's going to ask RFK Jr. his opinion on, you see certain things happening in certain communities. You see food droughts in certain communities. I believe he's going to touch on that. You see water issues in certain communities. And Jason's question is more so like, is this the type of thing where we're just targeting this particular group? And RFK Jr., he brings up something pretty interesting, saying that, well, it's not necessarily targeting any particular group, but when you live in a community where people feel that it's easier to put certain things, power plants, whatever it may be, in your particular neighborhood, the neighborhood that they're going to get the least amount of pushback, that's what's going to be a large factor in determining whether or not things are put in one neighborhood compared to the other. If you don't complain about the food desert, if you don't complain about these certain aspects in a particular community, they're not necessarily going to change it. It reminds me of growing up in high school. They used to talk about having lights. Like there was an issue with whether or not to put lights at the football field, our high school football field, and then the high school, maybe soccer field, the sports complex that we had. And the people on the street would complain. They would say, no, we don't want these events at night. And it's the type of thing where if you get certain complaints in certain neighborhoods, if people are willing to stand up for different things, they're not going to put certain things in that neighborhood. Now, if the opposite occurs, then that's why you'll see a lot of these things being pushed to certain neighborhoods rather than others. And he's probably going to go over it.
If I talked about how all these facilities are put in Black communities, and it's not necessarily racial. It's that, people are saying, oh, let's screw the Black people. It's not that in most cases. It's usually because they're trying to put them in the place where they're the fewest barriers. And if you put that in Beverly Hills, you're going to have people suing you, people calling the mayor's office, and, But if you put it in those communities of color, they don't, there's nobody there who can call the mayor's office. There's a limited capacity for them to make.
And they don't have the resources.
They don't have the resources to do it. And, you know, I'll tell you something. I sued the city of New York for many years. I was suing over the water supply. New York has the best drinking water of any city in the world. Its water comes from 3 big reservoir systems, and the quality of New York, it's unfiltered water. It goes right from the reservoirs into your taps with no filtration. That's how pure it is. It accounts for the incomparable taste of New York City pizza and New York City bagels. It's used by tea companies to test their teas, and it's the finest tasting water. It's regarded as that. There's 3 systems. There's 2 big systems called the Catskill and Delaware system in the Catskill Mountains, and then there's one little system on the east bank of the Hudson, and that's called the Croton system. That system is very low quality water. There's 102 sewage treatment plants discharging into it. If you drink a cup of coffee from that water system, during dry years, about 2% of that coffee cup has been through a sewer plant, and the sewer plants are all broken. So I sued the city of New York to say, who's getting this water? Which communities are you sending this bad water to? And they said, it's national security. We can't tell you. This was long before 9/11, right? This is like 2000 or like 1995. And so, but they finally gave me the distribution maps on the courthouse steps. And what it showed, the Croton water, which is the bad water, all of the distribution area, the people who were getting, the neighborhoods that were getting that water were colored dark. And it was Harlem, the Lower East Side, the South Bronx, Hell's Kitchen, it was all black neighborhoods. And I was looking at this map, and it was dark. All the Upper Manhattan on the east side was all dark coming down from Harlem. And there was this little tiny, like, it looked like one home that was getting the good water that they must have put pipes in. And I got out the magnifying glass and looked at that home, and it was Gracie Mansion, which is the mayor's house. So the mayor was getting.
I would say that this is definitely strategic oppression. And I honestly, this is, I want to go a little bit of a different route. To have a candidate with this type of history, in my opinion, it goes above and beyond like the typical policy talk that we hear, the economy, abortion, all these different topics that come up. Something as simple as the health quality, the quality of our water system, the quality of our food, certain things that he touches on. I don't think that we realize the type of food that we're eating and how that impacts us, how that causes all these diseases, how it causes us to have all these conditions when we get older, that obviously the big pharmaceutical companies are then able to say like, hey, we have this product for you that's going to help you. These are the things that I would want a leader to be focusing on. These are the things. These are the focus on the other ones as well. Obviously, we got to all make sure that we're putting food on the table, but these are the things that nobody is talking about that affects us on a day-to-day level. And when you hear about a story where it's like, yo, all the bad water in this city is being pushed towards certain neighborhoods over the others, what type of politician you think is going to call that type of stuff out? Like that's the person that we want in office, not the Barack Obama, where Barack Obama is going to take the sip of the Flint water and fake sip it and try to convince the rest of the community that the water's safe. This is what we're looking for. This is the honorable person that I don't know. But he's not as smooth talking as Barack Obama, and maybe not as well dressed. Who knows?
Getting the good stuff, but all the people around him were getting the bad water.
I want to move to
so this kind of wave of mass poisoning, of toxicity, impacts the black communities, because that's where the sewer plants are put. That's where the factories that have bad emissions, and those communities are literally getting poisoned by processed food. There's 1,000 ingredients in our food are banned in Europe. And those are the ingredients, the processed food ingredients. Those are the companies that control the food stamp programs. So when people need to eat.
Are y'all hearing what he's saying?
Eat from food stamps, 10% of the food they get is sugar drinks, which is poisoning them. And that's why you're seeing diabetes epidemics, you're seeing asthma epidemics in Black youth, you're seeing obesity epidemics, and all of these other diseases that are, that are a function or the result of mass poisoning. And these communities are food deserts. They don't have Whole Foods there, right?
What candidates do you hear talking about this? I'm just gonna leave it there. We're gonna move ahead. Like I said, it's an hour and 30. I had to pick and choose certain
middle class.
Segments.
That's exactly what's happening today.
Hold on. Let's move to this next
it was
one.
interesting. I was just at the White House, and I remember walking out in or outside the Red Room, and President Kennedy's portrait is right there.
In the building.
And as somebody who was born in '77, but close enough to understand the history of what your family's contribution has been to our community, I just see that photo, and it just reminded me of how politics should be working to advance the interests of Black people. When you look at what's happening now with President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris and the campaigns and all of the noise, where it almost feels like the Black vote or the Black interest is now a political ping pong, what are your thoughts when you see it between those two campaigns? Given the history of your family and what
yeah, I mean, it's interesting, largely because of my family as well. Prior to my family, Blacks voted predominantly Republican, and they started, Blacks were Republicans because.
Yeah, were y'all aware of that? He said prior to his family that the Black population voted mostly Republican. I think a lot of this stuff is this is just good. Some of it's just good history. Some of it should just get us to think. It's not about just the Black population, but overall, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we subscribe to this particular way of thinking? Why do we join this particular religious group? Why is it usually, and it's literally just, oh, that's what everybody's doing at the time. Oh, then everybody's making this shift over here. We're all moving in this direction.
Abraham Lincoln was a Republican who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. When I was a kid, my father, the original Emancipation Proclamation was in our home. He had purchased it, and it was the centerpiece of our home. But ever since then, Blacks had voted Republican, and then they started migrating into the Democratic Party during Franklin Roosevelt's term, because Roosevelt was passing all these laws that made it particularly for rural Blacks, made things a lot better. His wife Eleanor Roosevelt was a real fierce civil rights activist. Interestingly, you'll find this interesting. When they passed the labor laws, he needed to get the Southern states on board. And the Southern states said, we don't want Black people to be able to take advantage of labor unions. And so we want two industries that are predominantly Black to be exempt from any labor organizing them. One was housekeepers, and the other was farm workers. And that's why today, housekeepers and farm workers can't take advantage of labor laws. So generally, FDR was very good on civil rights issues, and so some Blacks were coming over. But when my uncle ran, and that turning point, and then he crafted the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and all of these other acts that finally made our country a true constitutional democracy for the first time in its history. And then the Black Americans came over to the Democratic Party, and they've been solid Democrat ever since. But the Democratic Party has taken, many Black Americans believe the Democratic Party has taken their vote for granted, particularly Black males, and that the Democratic Party has been involved in legislation that really has hurt Black people.
This common sense approach to politics It's Trump has his way of direct speaking, and I think for a lot of people that's what we were drawn, or some people were drawn to Trump and still are drawn to Trump, is because he just doesn't give you the whole like Gavin Newsom style pastor talking to where you feel like somebody's literally talking you out your pants or something like that. He's just giving it to us straightforward, and I think people appreciate this type of communication, realness from a candidate. And this is why you have a situation that we're going to touch on later with the Joe Rogan that says all these complimentary things about RFK Jr. And then you have Trump throwing like a temper tantrum, saying stuff like, oh, Joe Rogan, the next time he goes to a UFC match, he'll get booed, or with Trump just feeling some type of way. This is why Trump was on the phone trying to recruit RFK Jr. over. He's a very sensible, logical person, straight talker, and has a lot more, in my opinion, likability than the other candidates.
People in this country, particularly in 1986 omnibus drug bill, which made crack cocaine, gave penalties for crack cocaine 100 times powder cocaine. And then the 1994 crime bill, which had the super predator provisions and mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes you're out. Those two bills, both of which were written by President Biden when he was in the Senate, it doubled the number of blacks in American prisons.
And this is something that likes to come up, or whenever you bring up anything with Trump, this is what happens. And y'all know where I'm going here. Whenever we bring up Trump and trying to prove that Trump was racist, you hear about, oh, he didn't want black people in his apartment units, or he used to tell certain black people that worked at the casinos that replace them with white dealers. What else do you hear about Trump? The Central Park 5. That's a very big thing. And for me, when I sit back and think about all these instances, it shows just how emotional people are, as far as being more emotional than logical and rationale with determining their outlook on certain things. Now, what am I talking about? He's getting ready to talk about some of the things that Biden put in play, that with the crime bill, that locked up thousands and thousands of black men, that took thousands and thousands of black men out of the households. You heard him talk about when the crime or the punishment was like 100 times for crack cocaine compared to cocaine, the exact same drug, just in a different form. This is the strategic oppression that Jason Lee was talking about before. He's willing to call it out. So my main point is when I say that it shows me how emotional people can get. The Central Park 5, as emotional of a situation, as horrendous as people can say, Donald Trump taking out the ad to give those kids the death penalty, how many people did it impact? I'm just being straightforward. Yes, it was a big case. Yes, it was a big deal. All of these things can be true. But how many people did it impact? And you can say that it impacted more than those 5 kids. I'm totally understandable of that. How many things did how did it impact people? And what was the impact when it came to apartment units? Oh man, you're not in this apartment unit, so life is over. How many people did it impact if he was doing something? And these are just allegedly things that he was doing. I've looked into it a little bit, and I think it's a little bit different than how it's presented, but it is what it is. Do your own research. How many people do you think it impacted people to switch this black dealer for this white dealer? And then you ask yourself, the main problems that we talk about. We went back and forth on the last show talking about, well, what's the solution? What's the solution? And what did it all start with? The family unit. The family unit. This is what the crime bill destroyed. This is what the crime bill destroyed, this family unit. This is what intelligent people thought, that it was okay. Let me go about not only this crime bill, but it's perfectly fair and rationale and logical for me to have this penalty for cocaine. Who does cocaine? More of a predominantly rich man's drug. White people, let's just be honest. It's more of a white, when you compare the white versus black, more of a white drug. Crack cocaine, Who's that sold by? Who's that distributed by? Who's taking that? More of a black drug. Why is the crime for one so much more significant than the crime for the other? So these are the mindsets that you got to go into. So he's getting ready to talk about, I'm going to run it back just a couple seconds because the question that Jason Lee asked was, basically whose background in dealing with a lot of these situations when comparing the Democrats to the Republicans, who has the better record. So
times powder cocaine, gave penalties for crack cocaine 100 times powder cocaine. And then the 1994 crime bill, which had the super predator provisions and mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes you're out. Those two bills, both of which were written by President Biden when he was in the Senate, it doubled the number of blacks in American prisons. So the number of blacks in American prisons was steady from the Civil War till 1986. Within 8 years after that legislation, the number doubled, and now 1 out of every 4 black men has some encounter with law enforcement, and they're usually pretty bad encounters, and then they're disenfranchised because you get convicted of felony, and now you're a
second-class citizen now.
Well, now you're not a citizen. Yeah. So it's exactly if you were cynical and you believed it was purposeful.
But that's where maybe I'm a cynic, because I feel strategic oppression is the words that I use. And when I think about prison reform, and because I fell in love with prison reform when I had a friend get locked up in Kansas for a pound of marijuana, had never been incarcerated, and I just thought that's not fair. This is a 24-year-old person who was raising his 2 brothers with his grandmother. And so I called Mayor Karen Bass, now who was Congresswoman Karen Bass at the time, and she helped me negotiate his release from prison, exonerated. Now he's an entrepreneur in cannabis. But when I look at the history of,
and I see the chat, I'm throwing up some of the chats on there, even if I can't verbally highlight them. But we got double talking Danny. He back at it. It is what it is. But Danny, let me ask you a question. Because Danny, I feel like you're giving a real good insight. Let me ask you a question. Just wondering, when it comes to you, why when you hear RFK Jr., because I think this happens in a lot of our conversations. Somebody says something good about RFK Jr., and the initial response is to say something about Biden, something about Kamala, something about Trump. You said that he's a pro-black imposter. What gives you that vibe from RFK Jr.? What gives you that vibe, especially when he has such a track record of doing these things? He mentioned how he was fighting it with the water system, with the impoverished areas in New York City getting the worst water that has to go through the sewage system. We've also discussed on this show how he was standing up for a lot of blacks and Native Americans in New Jersey. From the Ford power plant when they were polluting their land and their water. So I'm just wondering, what makes us throw these names out there as if somebody's an imposter? Like, what gives you that? As somebody that doesn't live in the United States, as somebody that is not here, but seems to be a very big Democratic supporter, what makes you think that RFK Jr. is a pro-black imposter compared to a lot of the people that that you seem to be very fond of?
Prison, slavery, slave catchers, Jim Crow.
It's like a steady line.
It's a steady line to prisons and policing.
270 years of slavery, and then Jim Crow, and what happened in Tulsa with it was the systematic destruction of black entrepreneurship in this country. I mean, in Tulsa in 1908. You had one black man who went out there and said, I'm going to create essentially an empowerment zone for blacks. And he bought 40 acres. He'd only sell to blacks. And it was all, and, within a few years, there was this extraordinary burst of prosperity and affluence in this community. And there were at that time, there were only 2 airports in all of Oklahoma, but there were 6 black families that owned their own airplanes, right? And so you had this, and then that was destroyed purposefully. And that was not the only Black Wall Street. There were Black Wall Streets in Alabama all over the country, and they were all wiped out. And then, you had the Jim Crow laws, you had all these, and that's been followed by redlining, by the school to prison.
It keeps morphing into something else.
Yeah, the kids like whack-a-mole. They keep figuring out a new way to do the trick.
Yeah. But that's why when I think about your family's history, because, we haven't talked about your Uncle Ted Kennedy, right? We haven't talked about Maria Shriver. Your whole family is historically helped to move the interests of people to be equal or to be treated with dignity and respect. So when I think about that, when I look at even learning in your...
I got to highlight Lucille's comment real quick. So Lucille wrote, by listening carefully, there's someone who causes a problem and another to solve that problem. They create the health issues and trying to give us medicine to kill us further than heal us. 100%. This is what you just wrote, Lucille, is why I respect the candidate. This is why I'm showing RFK Jr. This is exactly why I'm showing RFK Jr. And not everybody sees it as how you just described. And that's another thing. So something can be very clear to certain people, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't hit home with others the same. Something can be very clear as with 2020. Very clear. Yo, they lied about this. They tried to, give us this jab. They were lying about what it would do, it would prevent the spread, all this stuff. They rushed it, all these different things. And now it's coming out that it caused a whole lot of health issues with people. We believed in everything that Anthony Fauci said. RFK Jr. already came out and said that they were actually getting royalties from certain types of the shots, from certain brands. Fauci, the person who's on TV, giving us the guidance, head of the World Health Organization, the person that we're trusting to just give us an objective, unbiased perspective. So therefore, we can make whatever decision for our health that we feel is best. Don't we think that it's a conflict of interest that the person that they're putting on TV all the time actually receives royalties from you getting the jab? But for whatever reason, we don't. It's not just black and white to us with that. When you look at the food that they give us, RFK Jr. just pointed it out. Why is it that certain food, processed food, is outlawed in all these other countries, but it's allowed here? Especially when we know that a lot of the processed foods, the sugars, the salts, all those things are what are leading to all these health ailments that we face with disease, whether it's high blood pressure, the diabetes, across the board. But it's like we it's like we almost just don't care. And maybe that's a bigger issue, because over the weekend I was having a couple different conversations, and somebody reached out to me, doctor that I happen to respect very much outside of his expertise as far as being a doctor, but just as far as like how he views the world. And he said, man, why are you doing this? He's like, yo, people aren't going to change. People are just going to believe what they want to believe. You'll be killing yourself trying to convince people otherwise. And at the end of the day, people are just going to do what they want to do. We live in a world where you look around and you go outside, everybody look at the health of people. We know exactly what it takes to become healthy, but we make decisions every day. All of us, we make decisions every day to avoid becoming the healthier versions of ourselves. We know that there's certain things that can add years on our life, but we decide not to do it. We know, I'm not going to bash y'all too much, y'all carnivores, but we know that the meat actually, regardless of meat period, but the meat that they're giving us in this country, we know are leading to diseases, but we still eat it. We'll still get Chicken Shack. We'll still get that bacon, egg, and cheese. We'll still get all these different things that we know are leading to a slow death, but we just do it. So going back to the story of what the doctor was telling me, it's almost like, bro, you're on a crusade to try to change people that don't want to change. So maybe it goes back to that whole Jay-Z conversation that we were having. Maybe I shouldn't be mad at Jay-Z. Maybe I should just be like, nah, Jay-Z's doing exactly what we all should do. Maybe we all should dumb down a message and dumb down an impact and we're going to talk a little bit about this later when it comes to purpose and legacy, but maybe you should dumb down the impact that you think that you can make just because it's like, who cares? These people ain't going to listen. They're not going to take heed to it. I don't know. It's a conversation, I guess, worth having or worth considering. All right, let me highlight a couple of these. Let me read a couple of comments. Let's see what Danny's talking about. So Danny said about RFK. I believe he's talking about RFK. He said he's a right-wing grifter with talking points that hit certain topics you'd be interested in, but in reality, he creates a tunnel vision, taking real concerns and pretends he cares. He doesn't care. Okay, so I saw that you wrote something supportive when it came to Biden and Kamala. Are you saying that Biden and Kamala care? Are you saying that Trump cares? Or are you saying that just RFK does this? Or are you just talking about more so politicians overall? Lucille wrote, they still see black people as slaves and people they can abuse on all levels, but we are not to give in, but break those chains using wisdom and knowledge because it was this way before July 1st, 1863. Danny wrote, it's bait. It's bait. Like the bait you put into a cage is real meat, but the meat is just to catch the meat, like fishing. Okay. And he wrote that RFK Jr. doesn't care. So clearly you're a fan of, the Democratic Party. I get it. And that's the thing. How could, and I think this is a good example that we're seeing with Danny, which is RFK Jr. can highlight everything that he's done. Danny's calling him, he just said the right wing doesn't care about black people. And when we say things like that, I guess you're assuming that the left wing does, since you just highlighted the right. And what's so, this is just maybe a microcosm, and this is why this doctor was telling me, like, bro, you're wasting your time. It's because no matter what RFK Jr. says, no matter what his history says, all of these different things, we will sit here and just, if we don't like him, nothing's going to change that. We'll say that he's a grifter. We'll say, I'm not sure what other things Danny said, that he's takes advantage or he's being disingenuous to black people, all these different things. It doesn't really matter what a candidate can show. You can show your history of actually making an impact with helping in Bed-Stuy with the Bed-Stuy project. You can show your history of helping with the water system in New York City. You can show your history of helping with the Ford plant in New Jersey. You can show a history. This guy's an environmental attorney. These are the things that he fights on a daily basis. You can live an actual healthy life like he does. When he takes off his shirt, it looks a lot different than the other candidates. Well, obviously, yeah. Well, when Biden was there, all these different things, and maybe it just doesn't matter. Maybe people just pick who they want to pick, rock with who they want to rock with, and nothing else matters. Maybe that's just where we are when it comes to politics. And one thing, and so Danny said that he believes that the left wing and the Democrats actually do care about black people. Okay, that's an interesting, and I want to be very clear. So Danny, you said you're in, not Switzerland. I forget. Tell us where you are again. In Denmark. I believe Danny's in Denmark, a white guy in Denmark. So from your perspective, that's interesting. That's interesting because I think that your perspective, being a white guy from Denmark, is the same perspective that a lot of black people in America feel. And I would say that have been misled and misguided and bamboozled by the Democrats to feel that way. But, everybody has their own perspective on it. Everybody has their own perspective. So we'll read Lucille's and then we'll get back to the video. We can only do what we can do. The extra mile is not worth cause, really, because really they don't care about us. Black people, they are fake when it comes to the black people. As a black people, we should care about ourselves. And Danny wrote, Biden-Harris put forward the American Rescue Plan Act to tackle historical discrimination in farm loans by the USDA. And see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So Danny's using this as an example to highlight what Biden and Harris have done for Black people. Do you consider what Trump did for the HBCUs? Do you consider what Trump did for the opportunity zones for Black people? Do you consider what Trump did when he created the council to look into the discriminations of certain things that impact Black people on a improper scale compared to other people? Do we look at those things? Because everybody has done certain things specifically for Black people. Do we look at the illegal migrants that are coming in and how that's going to impact perhaps a lot of Black people? Y'all heard Trump say they taking Black jobs, right? So it's maybe one thing that I'm learning is just that there's enough things that are candidates only need to do certain things in order to win certain people over. If you already like me and you want to, and let's say I'm a Democrat and you already are looking for a reason to like me, I could do 9 negative things. But if I do one positive thing, you're going to hold on to that positive thing because you want to root for me. You want to be right for the past 20 years of what you've been doing. You've supported this party for the last 20 years and you want to be right. You want to be proven that you were making the right decisions for the last 20 years. So therefore, you'll ignore the 9 negative things that my party did and just focus on the one positive. And that's what we're seeing. That's exactly what we're seeing. So, and I think that people become almost enslaved to a particular mindset of wanting to prove that their previous actions were correct. And what it does is it shuts us off to understanding and seeing new perspectives, in my opinion. Queez wrote, just sent you a video on shifting energy, changing mindset. Where'd you send it to me on, Queez? We may finish off today's show with that. That's actually aligned with where I was going with finishing off today's show. So that may be a good video to finish off with. Danny wrote, the illegal migrants is another talking point to tunnel vision the overall picture. Let me, as somebody who doesn't live in America, Danny, it may sound like a talking point, but it's actually happening. Like when you live here in America and you're not far from these cities, or you're living in these cities where a lot of the illegal migrants come in, I understand that you sitting in Denmark in your home, you may not feel it or care about it, but it's actually a real thing. So, to each their own. To reach their own. Let's keep going.